whichever party you have. Now, let me give you some illustration of how it works. A few days ago, you could read in the Financial Times, in an article entitled, the principal leader article on that day, in the Financial Times, the title was "A Partnership of Not Very Equals. The coalition has made a promising start." Now, imagine that was only the savagery of the emergency budget and what they have announced. And they pretended that there is nothing else they can do. How did they call the emergency budget? The unavoidable budget. How did Mrs. Thatcher call everything and the system? Tina. There is no alternative. So the tune is always the same. There are little marginal changes in it, but it comes down always the same. You don't even think about it. You should not even have you entering into this your head that you can change it. There is no alternative. The unavoidable budget, submit to it, accept it, and one of the other great financial economic periodical of the country, the Economist, had the leader article, leader title, which went like this. The title is also very nice. This is a title, so it goes like this. This won't hurt much. Fortune favors the brave, so tear up those election pledges and start from scratch. Now that's quite a mouthful of an article title, but the leaders of the Economist and sometimes also in the financial side are more. But what is in the article itself? In the Financial Times article, they admit that what they have, what they offer for public consumption is utter misrepresentation of the reality. And they even use such expression as misleading. This is, I quote from the Financial Times, charts that misleadingly suggested the rich would take a greater share of the pain than the poor were distributed to soothe lived-them nerves. Okay? So, deliberate, cynical falsification distributed all over the country in order to soothe liberal nerves, lived-them nerves, and think that we are all stupid, we are not going to notice what is a reality. And in fact, it came out by a financial think tank that it was a deliberate falsification, that it was the poor obviously are getting the lion's share of the pain, and it hurts quite a lot. So when they say it won't hurt much, well, of course they are talking about themselves. It won't hurt them at all, but it hurts millions and millions and millions of people in this country, and when you consider the global scale of it, you are talking about billions of people. That's the reality, that's the truth of the matter. Now, this is not the end of the story. In the Financial Times principal editorial article, which I just quoted, you also read this sentence. As one Tory MP put it, gloatingly, the Lib Dems are, and here the quote of the Tory MP's words exactly, like prisoners of war, being made to read out our propaganda, and they do it with more relish than we could. The Tory MP at least is honest. Unlike those who handed out those financial falsifications which distributed, generously distributed, with the lies that the rich are going to take the burden. Now, the economist is even more cynical. The economist in the leader article, again, that was the principal leader article on that day when it was published the 19th of June of this year. And in that leader article, I quote now, addressing, this was just a few days before the emergency unavoidable budget, addressing the government and all of them, take the radical role. Radical, you know what a perversion of the meaning of every word. Robbing our words and perverting. Now, you will hear what the radical role is. Take the radical role. Bin previous plans, and it's all an election prejudice, and offer up a fiscal system designed for the future, not dictated by the past. Abandon that promise not to cut health expenditure, so not to cut health expenditure, which all of them say, you know, all three parties say, and all three parties are, of course, cutting it. All right? That's again the contrast between the reality and the misrepresentation of the reality. But the economist goes on to say, abandon that promise not to cut health expenditure. The government should walk away from that commitment, blaming the unknowable fiscal horrors labor left behind. So they even give you the recipe. Put the blame on the previous one. That's always the rule. I still remember Harold Wilson when he formed the government. For a year and a half to 2 years, he was always playing 800 million pounds deficit, which is not chicken feed. 800 million pounds. I mean, every politician would love to have that kind of deficit. And for a year and a half to 2 years, Harold Wilson blamed it on the previous government, but that's all right. That is to some extent understandable, but justifying all his own failures and the Labour Party's failures to do anything, to take a single step in the direction of the promised transformation. And you remember how the Labour Party started its history as a radical party claiming to change the system. Social democracy itself, even with an awful figure like Bernstein, who wrote a famous book, much publicized, Evolutionary Socialism. You know, it's a contradiction in terms when you think of it, evolutionary socialism. But every single item of that evolutionary socialism so-called has been totally abandoned, because the history of parliamentary parties, the history of social democracy is the abandonment of everything they ever stood for, the transformation of all social democratic parties into neoliberal parties. And the same, you know, it is even more serious than that when you remember that there were two very important communist parties in Europe in the past. One was the Italian Communist Party and the French Communist Party. And also they have become nicely transformed. They transformed themselves, not outside transforming them. They transformed themselves into neoliberal parties. And the result is they also managed almost completely to destroy themselves. that's the reality of the situation. And of course, the fact that it had to take place through Parliament, to parliamentary action, is contributing obviously a great deal to it, because what was, you will remember the famous definition of what a labor movement should be like. It has two arms. The industrial arm, okay, which is the trade unions, and the political arm. These political parties which abandon everything they ever believe in the course of their activity in Parliament. Now, what happens in the trade, because at the same time it is said very clearly that the trade unions should never dare to involve themselves in political action. There is a whole range of laws forbidding that. And it goes also the other way around. The political parties should not be involved in serious, important industrial dispute. So how could the labor movement assert itself? How could the labor movement fight for its own purposes, for the transformation of the socialist system, of the system, a capital system, into a socialist system, as it was once premised, promised by the social democratic parties in Germany and everywhere. And of course, it is also well known that the moment the First World War broke out, the German Social Democratic Party immediately took the side of its ruling class in the imperialist war. Terrible, devastating history when you think of it, and then it followed up by greater and greater tragedies in the course of the 20th century. But how is this represented? Now I would like to quote for you a couple of passages from someone, Norman McCrae, who used to be for 23 years the deputy editor of The Economist. And his great achievement in this period was that he invented the word, according to The Economist, he invented the word Pascalism. Lord Butler, who was one of the Tory leaders, and Hugh Gaitskell, who was the leader at some point of the Labour Party. And he combined it, what a genius, because the title of the article about him, a three full-page long obituary of Norman McCrae, is, the title of it is The Unacknowledged Giant. Now, what does this unacknowledged giant, who for 23 years was also the principal leader writer? You must have read some of these leaders of The Economist, from which I also quoted. And one of them was again an immortal face coming from The Economist. McCrae, he argued that one of man's greatest problems in the coming years would be growing life expectancy, and advocated a system of planned death to deal with it. So watch out. Watch out. A system of planned death. Could it be compulsory euthanasia or something similar? A system of planned death. And that his wisdom was also exemplified according to the Economist, to which they fully subscribe, that Norman's critique of the welfare state was inspired by a similar belief in individualism. He pointed out, he didn't just assert in his nightmare, but he pointed out that the market had produced a remarkable equalization in people's lives. Now, how did a remarkable equalization in people's life. Today, the figure was brought up that poverty and death rate and life expectancy due to much lower expectancy due to poverty is much higher in those areas where the poor people live. Today, when this article, when the Economist is publishing its own articles, but that's not all of the great wisdom of the misunderstood giant or unacknowledged giant, because I promise this is the last quote I give from him, and this is again a direct quote from the Economist. Norman McCree advocated writing a cover leader championing a nasal spray to cure homosexuals who he thought were driven that way, driven to homosexuality, by their aversion to the smell of their mothers. Nasal spray to cure the homosexuals remembering the smell of their mothers and becoming homosexuals of that sort. Well, I consider this not unacknowledged or giant. I consider this sort of thinking next to insanity. And when you have this kind of perception prevailing, because the Economist is not just one of those periodicals published in 3,000 or 4,000 copies and distributed by voluntary work. Is a periodical publicized in 600,000, 700,000 copies all over the world. When Marx was still reading the Economist in his own time, it was a serious piece of editing and writing, and he called it for that standard, for its own standard, the country, the periodical in which the ruling class talks to itself. Now that seems to be the case. The ruling class needs a massive propaganda in order to spread it. This kind of great wisdom, of which I gave you some examples, spread it all over the world and have the mystification spread into also the ranks of the working class. Now, let me say towards the conclusion that why is it that the standard of parliament, the parliamentary system, which once upon a time was also involved in introducing serious reforms, it was involved in the establishment of the so-called welfare state in a handful of privileged countries after the war. Did a number of things. Now, this is all finished. Now, the role of Parliament is simply to impose the cuts, the savage cuts of which we have seen only the announcement. It is not specified yet, the details, how it will affect the people. Millions and millions will be affected all over the country, including this country, and in the United States. You have seen the crisis in the housing sector is worsening. It has now reached a figure in the people are compelled to run away from their homes, from their houses, which they cannot pay in the United States because of the colossal housing crisis, to the tune of 300,000 per month. And in the period in which this had happened, this is now amounting to 5.5 million houses in that way dispossessed. And who has the papers, who has the titles for these houses? The banks of the United States. The banks are forced to learn the meaning of the beautiful economic science term called negative equity. Now those unsaleable houses, which the economist also is forced to acknowledge that it will be, even after you finish with this crisis, it will take at least 8 years to redress the situation. So the crisis is continuing because we are talking about the structural crisis of the capital system. The parliamentary crisis, and I can recommend you to have a look at this little book. It's only 150 pages, which it gives you the evidence for this kind of crisis. That is going to continue because that is the parliamentary systems crisis is only part of the deeper, much more fundamental crisis, which is the crisis of the system, the structural crisis of the system, not a conjunctural crisis. We have been used to conjunctural crisis of capitalism for centuries. This is radically different. When you think about a conjunctural crisis, it is resolved by periodically, by every 7 to 10 years, by an upswing. No upswing. We have been now at the depth of the structural crisis for 45 years, and there is no long wave going up. When people talk about the V-shaped recession or the W-shaped recession, I say you are talking fantasy. What we have is what I would call, the square root, the sign of square root. Now we have the inverted square root shape. That is the real shape of the problems we are facing, and it will stay with us until a radical mass movement can counter it, because capital is an extra-parliamentary force which can only be countered through the development of a radical mass movement. And I would like to leave you with a nice Hungarian proverb as my closing verse. It says, "Nem babra megy a játék." The states are not a row of beans. Not a row of beans. The states are really absolutely fundamental. The states are the survival of humanity or the destruction of humanity by capital. And it will be up to us all to prevent that second, the destruction of humanity happening.
Thanks, István. After reading István's work, I was expecting a wonderful talk that brought theory to a level of practice. I wasn't expecting a nasal solution to homosexuality, but there we go. Can I open the floor up to questions and contributions? Can I ask people not to worry about asking simple questions? You've seen István's a world-class philosopher when he's able to speak in plain, simple English, so just stick your hands up to ask questions and contributions, and come to the microphone, please, because the sessions are being taped.
Hungarian.
I think our speaker has clearly shown the bankruptcy of parliamentarians and the futility of parliamentary road to socialism. A lot of Labour politicians, unlike perhaps Harold Wilson, never promised or said that they would bring in socialism. It was we were elected as New Labour, we were governed as New Labour, But I have two sort of questions really I want to raise with everyone. The first is, given that Parliament is